Ben Jonson's long poem in the First Folio is a major scrotum squeezer for those who believe Shakespeare didn't write his own work. This is because, to the legendary man on the Clapham omnibus, he's clearly telling the readers that this is the work of William Shakespeare. Yes, that William Shakespeare of Stratford-upon-Avon, not the exalted Earl whom most Shakespeare deniers claim as their major candidate for the authorship. How do we know? First, the heading is couched in familiar terms completely inappropriate to a commoner addressing an earl, and it uses the honorific Mr., which is a respectful and appropriate way of addressing the man from Stratford, but a calculated insult to a person of Edward de Vere's stature. Then there is the reference to him as an actor in buskins and socks. Shakespeare was a professional actor. De Vere wasn't. This is not in dispute. Mr. Waugh begins his analysis by observing that Jonson says that he's not going to praise Shakespeare's name, and then goes on to do exactly that. An impossible conundrum for the Stratfordians, he says, but he can only maintain that by hurriedly skipping the lines in which Jonson explains exactly why he does this. But thou art proof against them, and indeed above the ill fortune of them or the need. So Stratfordians have absolutely bugger all in the way of problems with Jonson's ambivalence on whether to praise the Shakespeare name. Jonson's comparison of Shakespeare with Kyd, Marlowe and Lilly is also subjected to the Waugh lip curl. Why is Jonson comparing him with playwrights of the 1580s? He sneers. This is something of an overstatement. Marlowe died in 1593. Kyd in 1594. Lilly does seem to have abandoned his writing in favour of a political career at some point, but he didn't actually die until 1606. And the work of these playwrights remained popular throughout the 1590s. Marlowe and Lilly both get honourable mentions in Paladis Tamia by Francis Mears in 1598, and Kyd's Spanish tragedy was so popular that it was constantly revived. Henslow's diary records two payments dated the 25th of September 1601 and the 22nd of June 1602 for additions to the play, so Jonson had good reason to be aware of Kyd's continuing popularity. We now come to the story of the decorative book header called The Hunt for Pan. It first appeared in a book dedicated to Edward de Vere by Thomas Watson called Hecatompathia, but then pops up 40 years later in the Shakespeare First Folio. This is claimed by Oxfordians as smoking gun evidence. As you can see, it provides the bottom border for the title page in the 1584 volume. In the Watson book, both ends have been omitted in an extremely clumsy way, which leaves some motifs half missing and shows only the heads of the two creatures at the bottom left and right hand of the picture. The tail of the creature bottom right is visible, while that of the corresponding creature bottom left is not, which spoils the symmetry of the design. Given the half-arsed way in which the printer has had to cram the image on the page, it seems evident that the decorative woodblock of The Hunt for Pan was not made for this particular book. Otherwise, it would presumably be designed to fit the page exactly. But the big problem in the Oxfordian claim here is that the First Folio isn't the only other book where this strange woodcut illustration turns up again several times. Most notably, it appears in the 1611 King James Bible and in Ben Jonson's complete works in 1616. So it seems that the woodblock was handed around like a spliff in a hippie commune for over 100 years. In fact, the mechanism by which the woodblock was passed on is surprisingly well known. To quote an Oxfordian commentator, Michael Hyde, the tracing of the ownership of the woodcut emblem from John Wolfe to the printing of Jonson's First Folio is straightforward. Wolfe became a close associate after 1591 of John Windett, who succeeded Wolfe as city printer, and after Wolfe's death in 1601 took charge of administering Wolfe's estate. Wolfe passed on his printing ornaments and devices to Windett as early as 1594, when Wolfe stopped printing and focused on publishing. Windett had taken William Stansby as his apprentice as early as 1590. By 1597, Stansby was a freeman and member of the Stationers' Company, and it is Stansby who was the printer in 1616 of Jonson's folio works, carefully edited by Jonson himself. Since Jonson was closely involved with the First Folio, it's hardly an enigma that the woodblock used by him in 1616 also turns up in Shakespeare's book 7 years later. So, mystery solved, except for the Calais greyhounds. You see, Mr. Waugh claims that those creatures at bottom left and right are actually mythical beasts uniquely used in the heraldry of the Earls of Oxford, even though when they're used in Thomas Watson's book, they appear only as bovine heads because the edges of the headpiece are missing. There is a Calais greyhound on the tomb of John de Vere, 14th Earl of Oxford, but is this the same creature as the one in the header? Waugh thinks so, of course. Look at the antlers, he said, which is weird because though the 14th Earl's creature does have antlers, the one on the header in the First Folio has bovine horns and looks completely different in several other ways. For example, John de Vere's creature has talons on all 4 limbs, whereas the one in the header has at least 2 totally bovine hooves. For those unconvinced, Mr. Waugh brings up the Edward de Vere crest and adds 2 figures from the book header. This is not what de Vere's crest looks like. Edward de Vere actually chose as the supporters to his crest a wild boar and a harpy. So I don't know what the justification is for this paste-up fake creation. Mr. Waugh also claims that the flowers in the book header are columbines, and that this is also a device used by the de Vere family. One problem is that the blooms in the picture can only be described as some flowers, and his evidence for the assertion that they were a symbol of the de Veres is from an unidentified text which refers to the property of the 13th Earl of Oxford, who had died in 1513. As for whether the flowers in the headpiece are actually columbines, I suggest you judge for yourself. Back to the poem, and the lines that are the biggest obstacle for those who think Shakespeare didn't write his own work. Sweet Swan of Avon, what a sight it were to see thee in our waters yet appear, and make those flights upon the banks of Thames that so did take Eliza and our James. The meaning on the face of it is obvious, since Shakespeare came from a town on the Avon and spent his professional life within pissing distance of the Thames. But this is not a conclusion that Oxfordians are happy to share. It is absolutely vital that they find some way of providing at the very least some kind of plausible deniability here. And Chief Executive Officer of Plausible Deniability Inc. is Alexander Waugh, who is methodically working through the many, many examples of Shakespeare's contemporaries having the temerity to say that Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare, desperately seeking some tiny bit of fluff to cover the nakedness of yet another chunk of inconvenient evidence. His theory on the Sweet Swan of Avon lines goes something like this. William Camden, in a popular history book of the time, quoted another antiquary called Leland, who said that Hampton Court was once known as Avon, or Avondunum. Thus, says Waugh, when Jonson apostrophises Shakespeare as Sweet Swan of Avon, he actually means Sweet Swan of Hampton Court, and he is referring to performances given at that royal palace for Eliza and our James. But if you want to assert that Hampton Court was a byword for royal performances, then you need to prove it. The only evidence that Waugh cites in his essay on the subject, there isn't any on the actual video, is a reference to E.K. Chambers, The Elizabethan Stage, 1923, Volume 4, pages 77 to 128 passim. I am gobsmacked that he presents this as part of his argument. In the 56-year period, from 1559 to 1615, plays were performed at Hampton Court only 13 times. By contrast, Whitehall Palace alone played host to dramatic presentations no less than 34 times. James I only staged plays there twice, once during the plague year of 1603-4, and a one-off play during a brief visit to Hampton Court. If it can't be proved that Hampton Court was famed for royal theatrical performances, then Mr. Waugh's entire proposition melts away like the Wicked Witch of the West. But actually, we don't need to go outside the words of Jonson's elegy to see that it doesn't really work. Try substituting Hampton Court for Avon in the famous lines of the poem. Sweet Swan of Hampton Court, what a sight it were to see thee in our waters yet appear, and make those flights upon the banks of Thames that so did take Eliza and our James. My first thought is, What the hell is a swan doing in Hampton Court? Swans live in rivers and lakes. The only time you'd see a swan in a royal palace would be if it was roasted whole or used to fill a pie. I know it's only a metaphor, but a metaphor doesn't work if it doesn't make literal as well as metaphorical sense. If the addressee is the man from Stratford and the metaphorical swan originates in the town's river, then it works. Used in connection with the man from Hedingham, it's nonsense. But of course, Mr. Waugh also has the problem of the other evidence contained in this poem, which is at odds with identifying the author as the Earl of Oxford. If we were criminally profiling the author on the basis of this poem, then we'd be looking for a highly experienced actor who had some grasp of Latin but pretty much no Greek. We'd be looking for a man with the status of gentleman. None of this fits with what we know of Edward de Vere, Earl of Oxford. When it came to Waugh's essay on this subject, either he was aware that the evidence was a little on the shaky side, or he foresaw a big objection to his evidence, was that William Davenant also wrote an elegy for Shakespeare, which also evoked the Avon, specifically at Stratford. What makes this poem more poignant is that Davenant was probably William Shakespeare's godson, and, according to Davenant himself, Shakespeare's natural son. Mr. Waugh never mentions this in his commentaries on the poem. How strange. Mr. Waugh's attempt to dismiss this poem as an elegy for Fulk Greville, who lived at nearby Warwick Castle, is staggeringly unconvincing. He points out that the word brook is capitalised, and therefore concludes that it refers to Greville's title as First Baron Brooke. He doesn't seem to have observed that many other nouns in the poem are also randomly capitalised. Tree, night, boughs, shade, plume, captive, river, eye. He claims also that river is a pun for our veer, as in our ver. Dear oh dear. That truly is the desperation of a man drowning in diarrhoea. And so another piece of evidence, exposed to the light, crumbles to dust like Dracula on a sunbed.